Today, I'm delighted to speak to Jake Broe, a United States Air Force veteran who served for 6 years as a nuclear and missile operations officer. And of course, you may know him better as one of the most prominent voices on YouTube throughout the war, someone with absolute moral clarity about who the victim is and who the aggressor is, and who brings direct military experience to his detailed analysis of the unfolding conflict. Please do make sure you subscribe to his channel. I'm sure most of you already are, but it is essential viewing to get Jake's content that he produces and the insights that he provides. There are also lots of familiar faces there, other expert YouTubers who you will find he's interviewed as well. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. If you find this video valuable, please like and check you are subscribed in order not to miss the new content that's published daily. Please also check out the new channel, Silicon Wafers. That features in-depth news coverage of the Russia-Ukrainian war. And a little snippet, a couple of minutes out of this conversation will be made available on that channel, uniquely on that channel, so you can get that bonus material. This format is designed to be much easier to consume, not the hour-long videos, but little 15-minute deep dives into stories that are happening and, of course, analysis of what's going on in Russia. I know many of the subscribers appreciate this slightly more punchier and in-depth format. But I'm delighted to welcome Jake back to the channel. This is the third conversation, and things seem to be speeding up, don't they, Jake? Every day, it seems quite a challenge to cover all the news stories that are surfacing.
Yes and no. I mean, I feel like we've gone weeks where, mud season or whatever, and there's just not a lot happening. But then when the mud dries out and people can move, yeah, it's been a busy month for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. So trying to cover this in the format that I do, there are moments where I'm like, can breaking news just please stop? I need to, at some point, stop collecting new information and just make the video.
And it's tricky, isn't it, as well? Because the initial reports often, there is a tendency to underestimate what Ukraine can achieve, overestimate what Russia can achieve. There are lots of biased voices out there. How do you cut through all of that noise to try to figure out not just what's really going on, but what your particular angle is going to be on these stories?
It's hard to say. I just try to take in the information as I get it. Let's not give Russia more credit than they deserve concerning their history. Russia loves to beat its chest about World War II, and that's the mythos that they've built around themselves that the entire world has had to hear about for the last 70 years. But let's not forget that, the Soviet success on the battlefield in World War II was largely in part because of Ukrainians who were in that military. So I don't like the framing at all that this is some kind of Slavic civil war. But when you talk about the military success of the Soviet Union, you can't discredit the Ukrainians, who were a large part. That's part of the reason why Russia is so desperate to reabsorb Ukraine. They want their people, they want their culture, they want their resources for themselves.
It is extraordinary. I mean, speaking on a video last week, I was stunned to learn that Ukraine contributed up to 40% of the GDP of the Soviet Union at certain points in its history. That is an extraordinary amount, given that they are a minority of the Union's population. And that perhaps goes some way to explain why Russia might want to reabsorb it. You've got Ukrainian creativity, you've got Ukrainian innovation, but you've also got the wealth that comes from the rich agricultural land.
Russian propaganda perpetuates this victim complex concerning World War II, that the Soviet Union was this peaceful utopia and those evil Nazis just randomly attacked it. And it completely, Russia kept the anthem. Russia views itself as the continuation of whatever Soviet history they shared. But the statistic that I like to share is that only 5% of modern Russia was ever occupied by the Nazis, whereas 100% of Ukraine was occupied by the Nazis for 2 full years. So when we talk about the atrocities and the hardship experienced by the Soviet people at the hands of the Nazis, Ukraine is the victim. They're the ones who suffered the most, not the Russian people. Yet Russia has just stolen that narrative and deprived Ukraine of their own legitimate history, in my opinion. So I like to share that fact whenever I can. The Russians are just out of this world ridiculous with how they spin their own history. None of it's true when you put it to scrutiny.
It's an extraordinary, isn't it? Getting sort of details, eyewitness accounts, obviously from the Second World War, is rather difficult now. But some of the facts are little known. That the most intense damage done to Kiev was not by the retreating German forces, but actually the scorched earth tactics of the Soviet army as they barreled through. And similarly, many Russian cities were turned to ash and rubble because of the choices of how to fight those battles and how to treat those territories once they're liberated. I had an extraordinarily this moment hit me like a thunderbolt. I was staying in a village near Novgorod, which is Great Novgorod, which is about a third of the way down from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and speaking to some very elderly people there. I mean, this is none of them are around anymore, but they still had the memory from their parents of that village being occupied by the German forces, and they would use the church spire to calibrate their artillery as they sought to pound the center of Novgorod. And actually, speaking to some of these old people and getting their stories, they were saying, "Well, the Germans weren't too bad. They didn't torture us, and they didn't destroy our houses for no reason, and we could quite happily trade our eggs, milk, and butter." And I almost felt one master or the other, it makes no difference as long as the master treats you right and allows you to do your commerce and whatever. It was a stunning kind of moment there. Um, we are getting some of that sensation, I think, in Kursk as well, that many of the Russians there really, your master is going to be your master, is going to be the person who is powerful, etc. But if they're a benevolent master, it really doesn't make any kind of difference.
There's no pushback. There's about 20,000 people living in the occupied territories. These are Russian citizens now interacting with the armed forces of Ukraine daily, and they don't care. I mean, maybe the true believers all evacuated, but for the people remaining behind, whether it's Tsar Putin or some foreign governments, once you said, as long as they can still trade their butter, eggs, and whatever, they don't care who's in charge of them as long as they're left alone. But I do want to say there was this video I saw 2 months ago that haunted me of a Ukrainian woman who was like 98, 99 years old being evacuated from Vovchansk. She survived German Nazi occupation during World War II. And then she survived Stalin and she survived decades of Soviet rule. And she says the Russians are the worst. Out of all the atrocities, out of all of the rulers, out of all the militaries that have taken her village, and she's survived all of it, the Russians are indisputably the worst.
And I was at an event, Ukrainian independence event, and there were some veterans there in London, and one of them actually, brought this up that he spent a lot of time over the last couple of years trying to figure out who the enemy is and how they behave, and still, I think, mystified. He speaks Russian, he understands all the primary sources, he can watch all the media. He has visited Moscow before. He knows a lot of Russians. Part of his family are Russian, and he's still scratching his head. And I think one of the answers is it's an incorrect framing of the question: is why do they treat Ukrainians so badly? Actually, it's they treat everyone badly, including their own. And I think once you realize that actually, the trauma, the violence, they don't distinguish actually between Ukrainians and their own. Given the chance, they would potentially sort of loot and maltreat their own citizens. Do you think does that ring true?
Well, you just, in your question, you just phrased the answer. They treat Ukrainians like they treat their own. When they say we don't view a difference between Ukrainians and Russians, they're the same people. Well, yeah, then you're saying you treat your own people like you treat the Ukrainians in the occupied territories. There's no difference. I mean, brutality, intimidation, lies. It's shocking to me as an American, as a Westerner. having grown up in a relatively peaceful country, the United States, my entire life, I've never experienced what I've seen the last 2.5 years, these videos on Telegram, how the Russians treat their prisoners, how they treat their women, how they treat the people in the occupied territories. I understand this is a different part of the world with a very different history than what I've known my entire life. The Horde lands going back to the legacy of the Mongols. When the Mongols showed up to your city and they said, surrender and pay tribute, or else we will murder everyone here, they did it. They severed heads and then they took those heads to the next town and they launched them over the walls saying, we just killed your neighbor, surrender and pay tribute, join the empire, or else we're going to slaughter everyone in this city. That's what the Mongols did. So that's the tradition, that's the legacy that the Russians inherited, the Muscovites, when the final Khans retreated back to their ancestral lands. And that's the way it's been for 800, 900 years. And the Russians understand what soft power is. They've tried to do good public relations. They want to have this new image that they project to the world, but in in the hinterlands, in the rural areas, it's still savagery, all of it. It's shocking. I had no idea it was this bad prior to 2.5 years ago.
And of course, it's framed as victimhood, isn't it? But actually, I think there's something more interesting going on here, which is what the Muscovites learned from the Mongols is not just suffering and trauma, but they learned it as a technique, as they learned it as a technique to build empire, to coerce and subjugate their own people, and to keep their, I would say, sort of vertical power structure intact, keep the boyars, the aristocrats, and so on, keep them in line as well. So it's a political technique that perpetuates that trauma. It's not just trauma on its own.
It's also the indefensible geography of Central Asia. It's just flat and open in every direction. And when an enemy unit, an enemy force gets into your lands, you can't use geography to contain them. There are no good mountain ranges or coastlines or other traditional geographic barriers to hold off your enemies. And the Russians have known this for over 600 years, which is why they, expand in every direction. Their entire military doctrine is based on strategic depth. Just get the core territories as far away from our enemies as possible so that when an enemy gets in, they're going to have to crawl over, the corpses of millions of our people before they reach Moscow or Petrograd or, the old capitals of the old Russian Empire. Nothing's changed. And it's really sad. It's really sad that in the post-World War II era, with this golden opportunity of a reset for the Russians in 1991, and they immediately, I mean, I'm sure Putin's not very bright, but he views himself as this historical expert. He spends time talking to or reading about Russian history, and he views this as his source of legitimacy for everything he says and does. But for someone who claims to be such a history buff to fail at this opportunity, because Russia doesn't need more territory. Russia had the ability in 1991 to become one of the most powerful and influential supernations of the world, with all of the resources that Russia was blessed with, their mineral deposits, their oil and gas, if they had just invested in their own people, built proper schools and hospitals and infrastructure I mean, we could be arguing that Russia today, 30 or 40 years later, could be an economic powerhouse comparable or greater than Germany or Japan. It should be number three if it was a real democracy with real human rights and protections, and they actually had an economic agenda that worked for all Russians, as opposed to their limited 80 billionaires, the oligarchs.
Let's turn to course because it seems to me, at least, that Ukrainians are starting to build their campaigns and strategy around the understanding of the Russian mindset that we've just been talking about, and Russian history and the political architecture. So how important is the Kursk counteroffensive on many fronts, military, social, psychological, political, and economic, because it does strike an economic blow against Russia's war economy too.
There's so many layers here with Ukraine's invasion and occupation of this 1,200 square kilometers, 92 settlements or whatever in Kursk. The first one is very important. Ukraine proved to the world Russia has no red lines. For 2.5 years, the Russians have been screaming, if you deliver any aid at all to Kyiv, we're going to nuke you. F-16s, Patriots, Leopards, whatever, we're going to nuke you. And now we have Ukrainian armed forces invading and occupying sovereign Russian territory. And nobody is talking about nukes anymore. Not Medvedev, not Putin, not Solyov, because they knew it was all empty rhetoric. It was all hollow threats. Russia is not going to use a nuclear weapon because there's no benefit. There's nowhere on the map they can nuke where a month later it'll be in their favor, because the global South, the Western community, will have such an adverse reaction to this change. The Russians talk about nuclear weapons so casually we forget that one has not been used in anger, in war, since 1945. This is a pact, I don't know how, honestly, that humanity has kept with itself for over 80 years, that so many countries, it really is a lot now. There's what, 8 or 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and none of them have ever used them. Because I argue there is no benefit. Putin knows this. There's nowhere on the map you can nuke where a month from then, it'll be to their advantage. So that's the important first aspect. The second one is just about winning. I hate the sports analogies because these are people's lives. People are dying. But yeah, I mean, people want to back winners. And if Ukraine can achieve something on the battlefield that looks like winning, looks like progress, in the big picture, this is, I think, a political or an economic collapse of Russia is necessary for true victory. But people love their map updates, and they love seeing the little shaded regions of blue or the shaded regions of red changing. So yeah, by having momentum, getting across the border, occupying territory, we're already seeing it in the polls. I just saw yesterday from the Brookings Institute, they conducted new polls. What do Americans think about support for Ukraine continuing? And there's been a sharp spike in increase over the last 3 weeks. Just with Ukraine getting back in the headlines, showing progress somewhere on the map, people are now saying, wow, I didn't think Ukraine could do this. Maybe Ukraine can win this war. So this is the political debate that I think Zelenskyy has been thinking about nonstop for the last 9 months, because here in the United States, we're going to have this debate again. Everyone's waiting until the November election is over, but late November, December, or January, Congress is going to have this debate again about another $60 billion in military assistance for Ukraine for the next fiscal calendar year. And if we get to mud season and Ukraine is still holding this territory, that's a talking point. That's a debate point in Congress where the congressmen who support Ukraine can put up a map when speaking on the House floor saying, look at what they've done when we give them the tools to succeed. Let's continue this for another year or two.
And that raises a really interesting question. It's one that we started to explore with Ben Hodges sort of earlier today when I spoke to him. And this is the idea that many analysts look at course and go, okay, well, Ukraine will take this. They might hold it, they might not. But they don't really think about what might come next. And those who know what come next, of course, aren't going to mention it. But Ukraine does have potentially a number of options. And we are starting to see them push into Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, and we're also starting to see them push into Kharkiv. I mean, there's a possibility there that they may actually push Russians beyond, back over the Russian border, and keep going a little bit in order to secure that territory, create a buffer zone for artillery fire. There's lots of options. They could also push south. They could push north. And a really interesting development is the massing of Belarusian armor and troops on the border. I don't know if you think that that is a serious threat at all, or whether it's just a piece of saber rattling. But if Ukraine was to strike north, it could potentially cut Belarus off from its ally. And that might let's say encourage some independent spirit amongst the Belarusian people. So I think there's an extraordinary lack of imagination on our side about what Ukraine can do, and I think Ukraine is starting perhaps to think quite imaginatively about these options. Do you think it's worthwhile speculating about this?
It was Anders Puck Nielsen who I think first pointed this out in the video. Part of the reason why in May or June Russia reinvaded Kharkiv is they wanted to put pressure on the border region for Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine to take serious, the border security between Sumy and Kursk and Bryansk and Belgorod. And even though the Russians have made very little progress in Kharkiv, they only went 5 kilometers deep. People who supported Russia were saying, well, this has value, this has benefit, because now Ukraine has to fully staff and commit to protecting their entire border. Well, Ukraine looked at what the Russians did in May and June and said, well, why don't we just do that to them? So this invasion of Kursk caught them off guard. Russia was trying to cheat. They were trying to send their best forces, all their contract soldiers, to the actual war zone. Well, it's all the war zone, but the axis they were focused on in Donetsk. And they were just going to staff the border with conscripts, people who didn't volunteer for this war, people who have no real training, no real equipment. They put some Chechens there as well, basically just to intimidate and bully the conscripts to keep them in the trenches. But no, that's not an effective fighting force. And the Ukrainians saw it and exposed it. So Russia was cheating. They thought they didn't have to take their side of the border serious, and Ukraine did in order to waste resources. But now it's been flipped. So concerning Belarus, Lukashenko is not going to pull the trigger. If Lukashenko actually wanted to invade Ukraine, he would have done it 2.5 years ago. Why did Lukashenko never commit his military to attacking Ukraine 2.5 years ago? And it's because Lukashenko's a dictator. And dictators only care about one thing: keeping themselves alive and staying in power. And if Lukashenko commits his meager military forces, I mean, his own military has been picked clean because Russia repurposed it all for themselves. There are pictures of the the Belarusian forces near the border, and they don't have things like anti-drone jammers on their tanks. Are they really going to cross the border with no proper air defense systems or no electronic warfare equipment? Because the Russians have taken it all back. So I want to believe deeply all these people are idiots. They could definitely make irrational and stupid decisions. So you have to take it serious. But no, I don't think Lukashenko is going to do anything. With the Kursk invasion, Putin got on the phone and just told Lukashenko, send everyone to the border to look like it's a threat. Make Ukraine respond to that. But in my opinion, the dream scenario for Ukraine is some kind of popular uprising in Belarus. Have Belarus become the second front in this war against Russia. If people remember the protests that took place in Belarus in 2019 or 20, I can't remember exactly when that was, but hundreds of thousands of people. This was Lukashenko's last election that was rigged. And Russia had to come in to quell that. Russia had to come in to help Lukashenko stay in power. So I definitely think the Belarusian people are happy to sit this war out if they can. But if their dictator forces them to start dying, they could take to the streets. And there's nothing Putin can do at this point, I think, to save Lukashenko if things tip in Belarus.
And I think you made a really fascinating point earlier about the spike in positive sentiment towards Ukraine. And of course, we have seen a media spike, and I don't know if you've seen on your channel as well. I tend to feel there's an uplift of interest amongst the activist and even the non-activist community as around Kursk. It does emphasize the point, however, that allies over the last year and a half at least have been trying to push Ukraine into a style of warfare that does not generate this kind of positive sentiment, that does not generate sort of maneuver warfare and the kind of things Ukraine is building opportunities to do in Kursk. It's as if we've been trying to get Ukraine to fight a war that gives them a disadvantage against Russian mass and brutality. And they've decided not to play that particular game anymore. And it's met with some extraordinary success. Why would we, however, be so afraid, so cautious, so timid of Ukrainian victories that we don't suggest to them to fight like this? They have to kind of almost do it in secrecy without telling their allies.
The ultimate fear is a Russian civil war in which regional warlords all have nuclear weapons. I mean, that's nothing's changed in the last 2.5 years. I've made this argument, but I don't think anybody in Western intelligence is trying to assassinate Putin. The Ukrainians might be trying, but the CIA, MI6, I think Washington, D.C. has told Putin himself, we're not trying to kill you. We're actually trying to keep you in power, but we want you to go back to your own country and stay there. The nightmare scenario is you die, and then people start killing each other in Russia with nuclear weapons, fighting over gold mines and oil fields and mineral deposits. My argument is we can't do this anymore after 2.5 years. Putin is never going to back down. Putin is never going. Putin is willing to die to get this some kind of tangible win for the historical record. This man is so delusional about his own greatness. So it's not up to us if Russia dissolves and falls apart, and then people start using nukes to kill each other, fighting over gold mines and oil deposits. It's not our fault if this happens. I understand we're looking at a nightmare alternative reality in the future where millions of people are dying. But we're just going to have to deal with it as a global community. If Russia collapses and nukes start flying, then we're going to have help from China. We're going to have to get help from India to find these nukes, contain these nukes, secure these nukes, deal with these warlords, and then come up with some kind of Marshall Plan to rebuild Russia. But I don't think Russia should ever be allowed to reconsolidate power in the Kremlin ever again, because this cycle is just going to keep repeating. I think the best scenario for the people of the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia is Russia needs to be decolonized. We need about 14 new Belarus-sized countries across the Eurasian plains, and let those people finally have real representative governments that share the wealth of their natural, landscapes with the people. It's going to take decades. It's going to take decades to stabilize this part of the world if Russia falls apart. But it's not our fault. We didn't do this. It's one man and what he wanted, Putin.
And I think that hard thinking, that hard planning is something which a lot of governments just want to stick their heads in the sand and really not think about it. One interesting point you make there, though, I mean, Putin is sacrificing literally hundreds of thousands of people, not just on the Ukrainian side, but on his own side as well, a sea of blood in order to keep himself alive day in, day out, week in, week out. And for those, I think, on the cautious Western side who are looking to manage escalation risk, we have essentially ceded escalation dominance to Putin, and there is no sign that he will show any kind of moderation or humanity. Last year, we had the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. We've had threats against the Zaporizhia nuclear power station. Russia seems to be intimating threats against its own nuclear power station in Kursk. I don't think Putin is beyond destroying his own power station if you think he can pin it on Ukraine. And it also seems that there's been a mass poisoning in the Siem River, which is that river in Kursk, which the Ukrainians are using as a kind of natural fortification. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that wasn't also in some way engineered to deprive Ukrainians of the ability to go through that water, drink that water, to get food or fish from that water or whatever. Putin, it seems to me, is capable of almost any heinous act. And the missiles that were flying on Monday and Tuesday were hitting the Kiev hydroelectric stations, but also it seems they may have been aiming for the dam itself. Unlikely they'd destroy it. But again, do you think Russia is perfectly capable of causing another ecocide if they were given the opportunity to do so?
Yes. Putin doesn't care how many people die. He doesn't care how many dams are destroyed. He doesn't care if there's another nuclear meltdown of a power plant. Nothing matters. He just wants to stay alive and look strong because that earns him political capital for doing his deals around the world. Concerning the river does flow from east to west, so it actually enters Ukraine after that point. But as far as poisoning the river, I mean, water tables extend in under the ground in every direction, so there's no way to effectively poison a river indefinitely. You can do it temporarily, but the bedrock and the soil acts as a filter. It'll just absorb it. So long term, you can't do that. As far as what were we talking about? You said
There's
the
the
power
nuclear
structure.
threat. There's the Kursk nuclear power station. Russia has been saying that Ukrainian forces have been firing artillery shells at it on occasions before where these kind of accusations have been flying. It is just as likely that Russians have been shelling their own infrastructure. And really, the idea, the speculation here is that they wouldn't be beyond, causing some form of devastation on their own territory if it was to deny that territory to Ukrainian forces.
We've been hearing this argument from the Russians that parts of their own territory don't matter. They argued this on Kremlin state TV that Russia is so big, the relative territory that Ukraine has taken in Kursk actually doesn't matter. You know, Solyov and the Kremlin has prepared people that this is the new normal. Sometimes Ukrainians just will occupy part of our country. It's not a big deal. Russia is massive. We're still making progress towards Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. The narrative that Russia inevitably will win this war, when there's nothing inevitable about anything Russia is doing. Their resources are finite. They can't do this forever. So I think we were talking about potentially Putin and will he ever back down? Will he ever admit defeat, basically, and try to go for peace? And I think that's what we've been seeing. I think the indications the last 3 months, Viktor Orban with his world peace tour and all of these flags are going up. The release of these Russian dissidents, part of this transfer of American citizens with Russian arms dealers and assassins. Putin is sending signals through proxies, in the Middle East, as well as, friendlies in Europe. They want a deal. They want a ceasefire. Putin gave a press conference saying his acceptable terms were give us everything we've failed to take, and we will start talking about a ceasefire. That's not really a good deal. But I think he knows. I think he knows how bad this is getting. Just this morning, another 3 oil refineries were hit. Ukraine just announced they have this new jet drone in mass production. And they just successfully test fired their own domestically produced ballistic missile. There is no one silver bullet. There is no one wonder weapon. But we keep seeing all of these additional tools, all of these additional capabilities. Ukraine is suffering. I'm not going to discount that. But considering financial and military aid being provided by the West, it's enough to keep Ukraine going. Whereas nobody's going to save Russia. Once Russia financially is spent, Chinese aren't going to loan them money. The Indians aren't going to loan them money. Once they can no longer pack planes full of gold to pay for stuff, people are going to stop giving them stuff. And we'll see if they can keep fighting or they want to fight. when hyperinflation comes and nobody can even buy food at the grocery store anymore.
And that takes us back to the 90s, where certainly in many rural parts of Russia, people reverted back to a barter economy. I mean, there wasn't even cash circulating amongst certain portions of the population. One can imagine a fast track to that for many people as well. Now, Ukraine has asked or has provided rather a list of targets in Russia that it wants to hit. These are the launch sites for Shaheeds and for various types of projectile, which we know are causing tremendous suffering in Ukraine and hitting its infrastructure. At this point, however, they're having to do it with their domestically made drones, as you mentioned, because they're not allowed to use the weapons that are ideal to hit the airfields and the launch sites, which is ATACMS. I think the Kursk offensive was designed partly to show that there are no real red lines, no real repercussions to striking deep into Russia. But unfortunately, the US has not lifted the embargo on that. It's not eased those red lines, at least publicly. And it has made sure, I think, that allies such as Britain cannot give permission for things like Storm Shadows to be used as substitutes. I mean, I know what you're going to say here. I mean, this needs to change, but how can Ukraine change minds in the US to get this policy reversed?
So for your audience, this is an admission, but I think the United States military has a veto power over what other allies can say and do that might lead NATO to go to war. So the Secretary General of NATO is always a European, but the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO is always an American. And the reason why it's always an American is because we bring the most military hardware to the fight. If NATO goes to war, all of the NATO and military assets of the other countries, Britain, France, Germany, whoever, they become subordinate to the US military chain of command in times of war. So any decision that other NATO military countries might make that might lead NATO to war is going to go across the desk of the NATO Allied Supreme Commander, who's always American. He answers to the United States President and the National Security Council, Jake Sullivan. That's why I'm convinced the UK wants Storm Shadow cruise missiles to be used, and it's the United States saying no. We can speculate why, and I've made the political arguments that the United States doesn't want anything crazy to happen prior to our November election, something that Donald Trump could spin that if he were elected, this could have been avoided, some kind of provocation from North Korea, Iran, or Russia. Donald Trump at the moment is losing, and he would love for some kind of wild event to occur that he could spin. Now, it could backfire. If Russia does something and U.S. service members die and there's a rally around the flag effect, that could help the incumbent party or it could help the opposition. So neither side knows how the American public would react to a provocation, but I actually think both. I think both the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign, they just don't want anything crazy to happen for the next 70 days. So I do think there will be some policy changes come late November, December, and January, but not until then. That's the political answer. We're speculating. The other aspect could be the United States just wants Ukraine to do it, so they have plausible deniability. These successfully tested domestically produced ballistic missiles, these new jet drones, we don't know what the United States is doing to help the Ukrainians or enable the Ukrainians to manufacture their own stuff. So they might be saying no to 300-kilometer ATACMS because they know in the short term, Ukraine's going to have their own domestically produced resources that can go a lot deeper than 300 kilometers. And then the United States can act like the good cop to the Russians. We can call them up on the red phone and say, oh, those crazy Ukrainians, you really upset them. Now they've got all these jet drones and ballistic missiles. If you want to talk Russia, the United States can facilitate that because we can work with the Ukrainians if you want some kind of deal. We've speculated this, both the Ukrainians and the Russians keep talking about peace plans and peace talks and peace conferences. we'll see if everyone's still talking that way after the November election, because it is all about framing the debate to get more military aid once those votes occur here in the United States.
And of course, Russia was keen on talking peace when it thought it had the upper hand, when it thought it had its hands around Ukraine's windpipe. Kursk, and as you mentioned earlier, the strikes against oil refineries, which do seem to be increasing in their accuracy and impact. And today, the first major civilian energy generating facility, electric plant, was hit, apparently the fifth largest in Russia. I think that's a shot across the bows to say, look, we can move this wider if you want, Russia. If you are so determined to take out our energy infrastructure, well, be careful what you wish for, because you'll experience the same thing. It does seem that Ukraine is trying to stack its hand, as it were, before a potential winter freeze and before the next calls for negotiations, to make sure it has a strong negotiating hand. Do you think that's one of the sort of significant reasons why we're seeing an uptick in so much Ukraine activity and so much, I would say, innovation and boldness from them?
I think Ukraine knows that a freeze in the conflict is a death sentence. You know, if Ukraine is not getting enough material to defend themselves today, why would they expect to be getting more if there's a freeze in the conflict? If we're talking about Germany reducing their entire defense budgets, you know, reducing their military support for Ukraine, well, it would be even lower if there was a freeze in the conflict. And Russia knows this, that if they can freeze it, then Western governments will lose focus, they'll lose attention. Western capitals will go back to talking about their own domestic issues and budget problems with health insurance and, you know, infrastructure or whatever. And then the Russians can continue producing everything as fast as possible, wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then just start the war again. Lights out for Ukraine. So we need to finish this once and for all now. I understand people are suffering, people are dying, but Zelensky's not going to fall for this. He knows that under no circumstances can they stop this war now, because Russia will just pause, mobilize, rearm, and come back for more. And it doesn't matter what Putin says in the short term.
Especially as the Russian economy really seems to be suffering, and China and Turkey, who are really dependent on those two countries for various sort of import-export credits and for the sort of financial machinery to help keep its economy going. That seems to have sort of at least paused for the moment under the pressure of US secondary sanctions. So this is rather a successful tactic, I think, of the administration, and one that is perhaps seen as less escalatory. Do you think Ukraine is super aware that this is the time now where Russia is perhaps at its weakest and most fragile, not just militarily, but certainly economically?
Prior to February of 2022, I was talking about finance and investing topics on my YouTube channel. So I was paying attention during all of the economic stimulus of the COVID era. When the pandemic kicked off, central banks around the world dropped their rates to zero. Governments just were handing out free checks to everyone to keep the global economy going during a pandemic. And it's 2024. It's been over 3 years, and the money still is going. Like, it hasn't stopped. So we haven't been in an economic contraction period. Recessions are inevitable. Recessions are the natural cycle of capital markets. And Russia's been able to coast on this war with high oil prices and an economic boom. I posted, something negative about Russia's economy on Twitter, and some random person left a comment saying, well, look at these bond rates. Actually, I think Russia might be a good investment opportunity because look at these returns. Money is fungible. You can put it anywhere in the world to put it to work. So there are people willing to still put their money in Russia and risk it for those high rates, those high returns, because asset prices everywhere else in the world are so high. When you look at the price to earnings ratio of the S&P 500, when you look at how high Bitcoin is, real estate prices, everything is still so sky high expensive, making relative investments for global investors inside of Russia still attractive despite the fact the country's at war. So when a contraction comes, rats flee the sinking ship. They want to move their money somewhere else. So I would love to see a minor dip in global markets, because I think the crash will hit Russia the hardest. And when the contraction comes, you just have to endure it. Eventually, it does bottom out, and then there will be a recovery. It's been this way for 300 years. People don't need to freak out, think long term. But in the short term, this could bring Russia to its knees. And we're getting close with the Fed announcing they're going to start cutting rates. Inflation here in the United States is already down, I think, to like 2.8% or something. Unemployment is ticking up. As an American, these are not good indicators, but as someone who wants to see Russia economically devastated and crippled, this could be beneficial to us this winter.
So I've got one more question on this main video, and then there's going to be one little extra question, a bit of bonus material, which people can find on the second channel. There'll be a link in the video where they can find that. The last question on this one, though, is, of course, winter is coming, and everything Ukrainians are doing is not just mindful of the election in the US. Yes, great book. um, and of course, Game of Thrones fans will get the resonance of that as well. But it's certainly coming. And a lot of Ukraine's calculus will be around the election cycle, but it'll be around potentially the difficulty of continuing campaigning through the winter and taking, significant territory, certainly within Russia. Therefore, they've got potentially another couple of weeks, another month or so, another couple of months to really make some significant progress, to keep Ukraine in the headlines, to position it for, as you said earlier, both the media and the sort of political community in the US to say, oh, well, Ukraine, wow, they did so much before the winter set in. Does that mean the next couple of weeks, next couple of months are potentially going to throw up some sort of extraordinary things? What are your expectations here?
We're still getting superlatives every day in this war, 2.5 years into it. This oil depot fire in Rostov has been going for 9 days. I mean, has the world ever had an oil depot fire going for 9 days? Russia just this week launched their largest ever air assaults, something like 230 or 240 missiles and drones in a single night. So I cover this war daily, and we're still seeing new things. It's not routine. It's not just the same thing happening over and over. So I still think for global media, they should be reporting this war. They should be talking about what's happening, because this is history. This is history happening right now. And for people who are fans of current events or history, I mean, if you want to be reading books about this conflict or watching documentaries 10, 20, 30 years from now, you should really be paying attention to it today. This is important, what's happening. Here in the United States, though, our politics is just insufferable. It's terrible, but it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. So I think as far as how can we get Ukraine in the headlines prior to November 5th or whatever, don't even try. But once the election is over, I think there's more room for more stories and coverage of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia.
We have to mention your drive as well. You're relaunching your fundraiser for vehicles for Ukraine. Could you give a brief description of that and describe how people can help towards it? Because the previous one you did was just beyond all expectations. It's energized the activist community. It's an incredible thing you managed to achieve there. And I'm guessing you hope to better it with this one.
So the organization that purchases trucks and drones and delivers them to Ukrainian frontline units is the NATO 69 Sniffing Brigade. They're based out of Estonia. So they contacted me if I'd like to do a fundraising campaign, partnered with them. I don't see or handle any of the money. I'm just the PR guy saying, I've partnered with these fine gentlemen from Estonia. Give them your money. and we'll show you the proof. We'll show you the evidence of the trucks and drones and anti-drone systems, med packs, socks, whatever. And yeah, it was incredible. For my birthday, I wanted to donate my birthday to Ukraine. Like, don't buy me anything, don't give me money. Donate to this charity drive, and let's see what we can do. The goal was $40,000. My secret goal was always 100,000, and it just took off. It went crazy, and we ended up fundraising $1.2 million. Over 15,000 individual people donated. So we waited 3 or 4 months. The 69th guys were delivering about 10 trucks a month. They had other campaigns and other trucks they were working on for other partners. So, but as soon as all 30 were delivered, we did another one. And I wasn't going to be shy this time. I wasn't going to try and lowball myself and say, let's just do 100 or 200,000. I just told my audience the goal is 1 million because I know it's possible. If 15,000 people got us to 1 million, and on average 300,000 people watch my videos, it's only 5% of my audience. Now, I know there's lots of people who don't have the financial means right now to donate, or they donate in other ways to other organizations. That's fine. Don't worry about that. Remaining informed, remaining engaged, watching these videos, you're already supporting. But yeah, we did it again. We did it in 7 days, exactly a week. We got to $1 million again. So this is going to be another 30 trucks, another 500 plus drones, anti-drone systems, med packs, whatever. And we're going to see these delivered over the next three months. I titled the campaign 1,000 Days of War because the 1,000th day of this war, since the full-scale invasion, I think will be November 20th, coming up in less than 3 months.
That's been absolutely thrilling, as always, Jake, and I encourage people to watch your material. If you want to see the little bonus episode, then please go to the second channel. But for this one, Jake, hugely appreciate you spending the time coming on.
Thanks, Jonathan.